Welcome to Spiritual Steps, a podcast about learning to pray, listen, and grow by taking small steps on the spiritual journey. I'm your host, Stephen Hovatter, and this is episode 3, Live in a Little Text. Live in a little text. It's kind of like a tiny house, except for it's a text. So anyway, in this episode, I want to encourage you to develop your relationship with Scripture by living in one of the shorter biblical texts for a little while, deeply listening to it. Okay, now, in order to get to that place, first let's talk about one of the obstacles that has to be overcome in order to grow in your relationship to Scripture, namely that the Bible can be bewildering in its breadth, daunting in its scope. The Christian Bible contains 66 books written over the course of centuries. It alternates between genres like poetry or narratives or letters, and it switches perspectives from one part of the community to another part. And the different texts have different concerns. They have different moods, tones, vocabulary and language, different structures. And the simple reality is that you're dealing with a collection of texts, an accumulated library, rather than a single atomic scriptural unit. And that presents an obstacle to us. It really raises the bar of entry into the text, into the Scriptures. I mean, to clarify, I want to describe two paths that people often take with the Scriptures. First, sometimes people often decide that they're going to read the whole thing, and they begin in Genesis, and then they go on into Exodus, into Leviticus, and their intention is to plow through the whole thing, and that can be great, okay? It can be a great practice in the right context, but there's a couple of problems. One is the very well-known problem of how people crash into the legal text of Exodus and Leviticus, okay? So you read through, these early narratives in Genesis and Exodus, all of a sudden you get into these, elaborate discussions about the tabernacle, okay, or these like ritual, procedures, and you just crash into that and you begin to drown in those sections because they seem mercilessly irrelevant to you. Now, I'm not saying, this is a very important note here, that I'm not saying they're irrelevant, but only that they seem to be so, because you have to develop a sense of the context surrounding theology for those things to become more fruitful reading. But at any rate, for most people, at this point, they crash into this stuff and the reading becomes a chore and it becomes very, very difficult to sustain, and people bail. Understandably, people bail because they're going to go through, weeks and weeks where this daily Bible thing that they've set up just doesn't provide them with any nourishment that they can tell. And when you're at that place when it's a chore, it's just not going to keep happening. It's not sustainable. So, that's one thing that happens there. And another issue in that is that, and it's really a related issue, is that this kind of reading, these small chunks a day over time, it creates this necessarily really fragmented reading of the text because you're just kind of skimming over the top of each text. You spend, a few minutes each day in like 3 chapters of Genesis or whatnot. And by the time you've read the whole Bible, like a year later, our attention span just can't hold all that stuff in it, okay? And so the context of how all this stuff works together, it's just kind of been washed away by the time of the reading. And no single bit has lodged into your mind deeply enough to really make a difference in the way that you understand the whole. So sometimes people respond to the issues with that approach, and they take another road, or they just start off in this other road, and that is to accept that the text is nonlinear, that these things are kind of separated from each other, and then they decide that they're only going to engage with small pieces of it at any time. Just seems like random pieces of the text. So they just like sit down, open the Bible, and just try to read some of it, just maybe at random. And that, honestly, that approach is often validated by the way that Scripture is dealt with in the church, where we only pick a passage here or there, or we maybe have, a reading from Corinthians one week, or then, something in the Psalms the next week, and who knows where the sermon's going to be from, because they're kind of picking things about these different topics. And we may be learning more about those topics, but we're becoming more distant to the texts themselves, okay, or really any sense of these being different texts. And people do this in their own devotional life, and they read a chapter here, a paragraph there, and that that can be useful. Except in doing so, you minimize a great amount of the context of all those little passages. And not only that, the randomness of it keeps you from getting much traction in grasping the whole of Scripture or any of the longer sustained arguments that's happening in those particular pieces of literature, right? And you end up with a pattern here, where every time you pick up the Scriptures, you're just hoping for something good. right? Hope something good will be there today, and something that seems relevant, nourishing, whatever the definition of good is, And sometimes you find that, and then sometimes you strike out. And frankly, it's a big book, like it's a big collection of stuff. Okay, and so there are lots of times where you just read a random piece and it didn't make any sense. And again, people just kind of move away eventually from this fragmented way of reading the text. So that's a sketch of the problem. And I really think a lot of this, both of those trains of thought, the reason they become derailed is because of the nature of Scripture, because of the breadth of Scripture. And it makes it difficult, on one hand, to study systematically the Scriptures as a whole. And on the other hand, it makes it difficult to casually pick it up and read in these random points, because at any point you could be dealing with something radically different than you did yesterday or at another place in the text, and you don't really know what you're going to get in any piece. And so those things, makes it really difficult. So I want to suggest a different approach to how you can engage with Scripture. And it's a small step, but it's a small step that can move you forward pretty dependably and pretty consistently. And that is to commit yourself to the study of a more narrowly defined piece of Scripture for an extended piece of time, okay, for an extended period of time. In other words, you're going to commit to living in a little text for like a month or two. You commit to this thing radically. Okay? Now, I'm not just going to study this week. I'm going to study, for a month or two. Now, by a little text, there's a couple criteria for that for me. Okay, one of them, it would be a text that can be defined as a clear unit, so it's going to have contained within it enough context, to make some sense of it, and something that you can read. It has to be something that you can read in a single sitting, pretty easily. Okay, not without it being this huge chore or task every time you sit down and do it. So I have some suggestions. Like you might choose the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5-7, or you might look at Jesus' farewell discourse in John 13-17, which is a smidge longer. Or you could take one of the briefer letters of the New Testament, like Colossians, James both of those would be great picks. Okay. Right now, our church has a couple of places where people are studying 1 John, like our youth group studying it, and we're doing some of that in the sermon series that I'm in. Right now, and 1 John would be a great text to do this with. Only 5 really pretty brief chapters long. Some in that neighborhood of about 3 to 5 chapters seems like about right to me. Okay, and if you want to look in the Old Testament, right, you could think of a book like Jonah. I think is a great candidate for this kind of approach, or maybe just the first 4 chapters of Genesis. That take you through creation and the Garden of Eden stories, and into the Cain and Abel saga, and Lamech after that. It's a really great piece of literature. Or you might take a handful of the early chapters of Proverbs, which kind of work together as a unit. I think any of those. I mean, I really do think that Jonah story would be nice, but whatever it is, you can pick one. And then here's what you're going to do, okay? You take that text, and instead of just giving it a casual read or mixing it up with, other text, take that little text and set out to really, master it. I'm not really comfortable with that language. I mean, you're really wanting to be mastered by it, but you really do want to deeply know this text. You want to read it. Here's what you do: you read that text every day, okay, for a month or 2 months, okay. You begin by small time to just kind of get your center, sit, chill, rest, and you want to pray, and then you want to read through it. Just simply read through it front to back, okay, from the beginning to the end. Do that for just 2 or 3 days. Just simply reading, not really doing anything else. You're just kind of calmly, openly, just reading the text, okay, and then start taking. After 2 or 3 days of that, you start taking 2 minutes, a minute at the end of the reading, and just take a note or two. Just get a sheet of paper or a journal or something like that, and just write the date, and then just a line, something that popped up to you in the text, something that stood out, or maybe a question that came from the reading to you. Okay, and then as you accumulate these, start reading over those notes before you're reading, and then again after you're reading, and then keep adding to them, okay, line by line by line. So you do this for a month, you got 25 things or something like here, and really what you do is, as you're doing that, you're beginning to kind of get this sense of what the text is like leading you, or what's important to in the text. All right. After a while, you can add a little bit more to that. You can bring somebody else in the conversation. Maybe you could read something, whether that's something that you just kind of look it up on the internet, which danger, but still, you can, after you've begun to read it some yourself, you do something like that, or maybe you can get like a brief commentary on the text, or you reach out to like a spiritual mentor, and have a full conversation about the reading with that person, but you press on. Don't bail from it yet, okay? Even after you've done some reading yourself, because you want to pursue deep knowledge of that text. Okay, so what you're working towards here is developing the capacity to fully hear it. You want to push towards a place of saturation, like where the text is like fully saturated your mind and your heart, so that as you're reading it, you're like much not just familiar with it, but you know it. Like you really know inside and out what the text is calling you towards. Okay, what God might be calling you to understand and to do and to become from that text. And you want to like make that text like your little Bible. Now there's something sure to be said for having a broader appreciation of the whole Bible, okay? But the truth is that when you dive in and these parts of it like inside and out, them really, really well, then you're going to have a better appreciation for the greater context, okay? So you do this, you focus on it, and you become more prepared to kind of move on. And then maybe after that, after you come to a place of saturation with this text, then you go on to another little text, and then maybe another one, and then maybe you're ready for like a larger, more complicated one. You take these on just like one step at a time. Then you start to have this much better appreciation for the canon, like how these different pieces like function, and maybe the way that they come together, because you have a deep enough of a hold in these particular parts of the text that when you're reading in other places, you're going to start feeling the connection with those kind of these things become like anchor text for you, okay? And you start connecting things to them in different ways, okay? And that becomes a dynamic process for how you grow in listening to the Scriptures over time. I mean, it's very, very difficult to grow in understanding the Scripture by trying to tackle it all at once, and it's difficult to progress if you're just randomly chipping away at it and these kind of random bits. But this approach, instead, to taking these little texts, it's meant to help you methodically grow by fully and deeply engaging, but just one small text at a time. So pick a little text and live in it. Really live in it for a little while. And take that approach faithfully, and then the Scriptures will begin to open to you in new and really exciting ways. So that's all for this episode. Thanks for listening. You can catch up with me on Twitter at the handle @StephenHovatter. It's linked in the show notes. I'd love for you to share this episode with some of your friends, maybe even partner with them on a particular text. That's a great way of doing this, is to read a particular text with a small group of people. And also, please remember to subscribe in your podcast app choice, iTunes, Overcast, or whatever. And we'll be back with a new episode next week. Until then, keep taking the next step that you see in front of you. And may God be with you on each step of the journey. Peace.